Hi everyone, back to the Doldrums, and guess what? We're on part 3. It's called The Journey Begins. And we're on chapter 12. The Journey Begins. Preparing an expedition is no small undertaking. Expeditions require thoughtful work and organization. This much Archer knew, and he wasted little time putting a plan in order. I know I said I've been lots of places, said Adelaide, but I don't think I can help you with this. Don't worry, said Archer. What's important is that you've done other things because I've done nothing. This is a book request card, and it says, Miss Whitehead, can you please find every book you can on Antarctica? Thank you, Archer Helmsley. Should I be worried? Asked Miss Whitewood. She placed her hand on Adelaide's shoulder. I hope they're not dragging you into anything. Oliver frowned. No offense, Miss Whitewood, but I don't think that's possible. Miss Whitewood pointed to a table holding a massive stack of books. That's everything I could find, she said. Archer reviewed the stack. It would require prioritizing. He divided up the books and they carried them into the reading room. The janitor was dusting a windowsill as they entered. He chuckled when he saw Adelaide. How was that Thai ferry? He asked. Adelaide smiled. Very nice. She's been to Thailand too, whispered Oliver. I guess so, said Archer. In the weeks that followed, the trio spent much of their time in the reading room and students' room before, between, and after class, reading as many books on Antarctica as they could. Many of the books were old and dense and tedious, to say the least. Archer was fine with this. Oliver and Adelaide grew bored. They sorted through the stacks, placing the boring books next to Archer and the books with photos and diagrams next to themselves. Archer made notes in his journal as he read. He shared the important notes with the others, but thought it best to keep the more terrible details to himself. The ship Endurance was trapped in ice, it said. The ice squeezed the ship. Sounded like heavy fireworks and blasting of guns. The ship sank, and the crew was stranded. Hopefully the worst part will be by the Drake Passage, he said. But once we're past that, the rest should be fine. I don't get it, said Oliver. Archer glanced over his notes. It says the Drake Passage is... No, I got that, said Oliver. What I don't get is why seals start out all fluffy and white and then they turn into giant sausages. Sausages with teeth, said Adelaide. Focus, said Archer. Catching a glimpse of Oliver's book, he tilted his head. It really does look like a sausage. They're up to something strange, said Alice P. Suggins. We should tell Mrs. Merkley. She might reward us. I'm not saying anything to her, said Charlie H. Brimble. She makes my thoughts get all confused. It's true, said Molly S. Mellings. We'd accidentally say that we were the ones up to something strange. Charlie leaned against the back of the couch and skimmed a page over Adelaide's shoulder. Antarctica, he said. Are you hoping to lose your other leg? Oliver lowered his book and glared at Charlie. Why don't you go play with your chickens, String Bean, he said. Archer started laughing and Adelaide giggled too. Charlie slunk away. Adelaide suggested they sneak out of the button factory during lunch and go to her father's cafe, where they could speak without anyone overhearing. What about your father overhearing? Asked Archer. He only underhears, said Adelaide. Archer said their best escape option would be an exit near the northwest corner of the courtyard. This wing of the button factory was mostly storage rooms, which meant fewer teachers to catch them, and a tunnel led them from the courtyard through the building and out onto the street. So as the students made their way to the dining hall, the trio broke ranks, scurried across the courtyard, around the crumbling fountain, and through the tunnel. From there, it was only 2 blocks north to Howling Bloom Street and Mr. Belmont's cafe. It is a pleasure to meet you, Archer, said Mr. Belmont. He turned to Oliver. And you are? Oliver shrugged. I'm just a glub, he replied. Oliver Glubb, said Adelaide. Glubb, repeated Mr. Belmont. That's an intriguing name. Yes, well, very good. The cafe was crowded, but the patrons were too busy drinking coffee and reading newspapers to pay them any mind. Archer noticed the flowery woman sitting in the corner drinking enough espresso to kill a small hippopotamus. But after their third lunchtime visit, even he developed a taste for that potent brew. Mr. Belmont was pleased. You might like this one too, he said, placing another cup in front of Archer. That will get the mind soaring high above the clouds on subtle hints of orange peel. During their lunches, they continued to discuss the matter at hand. One day, Archer brought maps of Antarctica that he found in the map room of Helmsley House. They pushed aside their cups and plates and spread the maps over the table. "That's Antarctica," said Oliver. "It's gigantic." "It is rather large," agreed Adelaide. "It'll be fine," said Archer. "Ships at sea must follow specific routes, like cars on roads. So any ship we take should follow the same path my grandparents did." "But icebergs float," said Oliver. "It won't be in the same place." "Maybe it will have come full circle," said Adelaide, "and be where it was 2 years ago." Archer lowered his third espresso with a shaky hand. "I don't know," he said. "If it's there, and if it's not, it's not. But there's really no sense at all in wondering what will be until we're there. I think it's there. It has to be there, you know?" Adelaide pulled the cup away from him. "I think you've had enough of that," she said. On their way back to the button factory, the trio sometimes stopped across the street at Duttonlick's for something sweet. Oliver was right. It was a terrific shop with windows displaying all sorts of delights, and the thick aroma of chocolate to greet their noses as they stepped inside. Spiraling up to the ceiling were racks of lollipops, dollops of taffy, and great mountains of chocolate bars. Oliver preferred to take his time, but Archer knew being late to Mrs. Merkley's class would be a mistake. "How about candied cherries?" he asked, trying to hurry Oliver along. Oliver was incredulous. "Candied cherries," he repeated. "No one enters Duttonlick's to buy something as boring as candied cherries." "Well, what do you want?" said Adelaide, inspecting a row of sea-green seahorse lollipops. Oliver wanted the whole store, but settled for a caramel cream chocolate bar. They paid for the chocolate and headed back to the button factory. Oliver broke the bar into 3 parts, and they walked in silence as the chocolate and caramel cream melted in their mouths. They passed beneath the archway and stepped into the courtyard, joining the other students heading to afternoon class. "Does your father have a freezer at his shop?" Archer asked. "I don't think so," said Adelaide. "Why?" "Because we have no experience with Arctic temperatures, not even close, and I think we should at least have some sense of what it will be like." "We could do something with ice after school," Adelaide suggested. It wasn't a terrible idea, but they couldn't do it that day. "Archer and I have something personal we have to do today," said Oliver, trying his best to look casual about it. "Something important," Archer added. Adelaide shrugged. "That's fine," she said. "We'll do it tomorrow." They made it to class just as Mrs. Merkley returned from the teacher's lounge. Mrs. Merkley had not softened since the first day of school. The students tried their best to resist a cough or a sneeze, fearing even these would land them in a heap of trouble. And they were right. Digby Figg spent an entire afternoon scraping gum off the bottom of Mrs. Merkley's desk when he was unable to stop hiccuping. The students suppressed their grins as each hiccup caused Digby to smack his head against the underside of the desk. During Mrs. Merkley's class, Oliver distanced himself from Archer and Adelaide. He was afraid Mrs. Merkley would make a connection between them. But Mrs. Merkley was no fool. She suspected an unsavory alliance was forming after spotting the trio numerous times in the corridors and the library. Archer was unaware of this until he spotted her in the library that afternoon. "Still, just the librarian, I see," Mrs. Merkley said as she approached Miss Whitewood's desk. Miss Whitewood smiled politely. "Can I help you find a book?" she asked. "Do you have something specific in mind?" "Of course I do," huffed Mrs. Merkley. "It's dangerous business leaving your mind open around books. I require a text on the current colonial uprisings, the role the French played, and how the British dealt with them." Archer slipped out from behind the bookshelf and into the reading room. "I'll see what I can find," Miss Whitewood said. As Miss Whitewood scoured the shelves, Mrs. Merkley strolled toward the reading room. "Close your books," whispered Archer. "Why?" asked Oliver. There was not time to explain. He grabbed Oliver's book and tossed it behind the couch. Adelaide quickly shut hers. Archer slid his notebook into his pocket and sat down. When Mrs. Merkley stepped into the room, Oliver took his strategy to a new level and nearly fell off the couch. "Just as I suspected," Mrs. Merkley announced proudly, towering over them. "And what, may I ask, are you 3 up to?" "2," clarified Oliver. "I'm not with them." Adelaide jabbed him and beamed at Mrs. Merkley. "We're keeping our heads where our heads ought to be," she said. "In books," added Archer. "Books that have nothing to do with polar bears." "Or guillotines," said Adelaide. "Or icebergs," mumbled Oliver. Mrs. Merkley leaned forward to grab Adelaide's book, but Adelaide pulled it tight to her stomach. "I found a few books for you, Marjorie," Miss Whitewood called from her desk. Mrs. Merkley gave all three a contemptuous eye before leaving. Adelaide gave that same eye to Oliver. "Two," she repeated. "You stand up to the string bean, but not her." "She has a lot more hip and shoulder," said Oliver. "Don't worry," said Archer, "but we have to be more careful." "And we better go," said Oliver. "Archer and I have that personal thing we need to do." The following day after school, Adelaide and Oliver climbed down the ladder to Archer's bedroom. Archer had 3 coolers lined up. Adelaide unzipped her bag and handed out earmuffs, gloves, and scarves. Archer added the coolers and they all sat down. "What exactly are we doing?" Oliver asked. "I guess we'll just eat as much as we can," said Archer. As they began to do just that, there was a knock at the door. Oliver and Adelaide dashed behind the bed. Mr. Helmsley entered to ask Archer why there was a trail of water leading from the kitchen to his bedroom. "What are you doing?" Mr. Helmsley asked slowly when he saw Archer in earmuffs sitting before a cooler of ice. Archer knew there was nothing he could say that would make this look any less unusual, so he told the truth. "Eating ice," he replied. "Eating ice?" repeated Mr. Helmsley. He shook his head. "And she thinks it's for the best we keep him locked up in here." "Well, I'm glad to see you're keeping busy." Archer, Oliver, and Adelaide continued eating ice after Mr. Helmsley left, but 10 minutes later, they'd all had enough. "This was a terrible idea," said Adelaide. Oliver was oscillating between this world and the next. Adelaide smacked his back and an ice cube shot out of his mouth. "Thanks," he sputtered. "I guess we can try it again some other time," said Archer, pulling off his earmuffs, "unless we find a better way." Oliver stood up. "I'm going to get some tea to bring us back to room temperature," he said. Archer and Adelaide waited on the roof while Oliver went to his kitchen, but for cake, not for tea. Today was Adelaide's 11th birthday. Though she made no mention of it, Mr. Belmont, however, had discreetly told Archer the date during one of their cafe meetings. So Archer and Oliver had spent the previous afternoon doing something personal. They'd spent the afternoon with Mrs. Glubb in the Glubbs' kitchen, learning how to make a cake. "Now, it's not very complicated," said Mrs. Glubb, "but timing is everything. Archer, you get 3 eggs, and Oliver 2 cups of flour." Making a cake might not be a complicated process, but there will always be a few kinks the first time you try anything. Mr. Glubb spotted a few kinks the moment he stepped into the kitchen. We're not going to eat that, are we?" he asked. "Does it look that bad?" said Archer. "Well," said Mrs. Glubb, "I can't say it's what I was picturing, but there's a lot of heart in that cake." Oliver agreed. "I think it looks good," he said. Oliver returned to the rooftop with the large Glubb and Helmsley original cake. Adelaide stared at them both. "Your father told us," said Archer. "Sorry I made you eat ice on your birthday." Oliver set the cake on the chimney. "Don't worry," he said. "This will taste better." If you tipped your head to the left and closed one eye, it looked just like a store-bought cake. And it did taste better than ice, which Oliver was glad to hear. "The peanut butter and blueberry filling is wonderfully original," said Adelaide. "We tried to follow the recipe," said Archer, "but lost it halfway through." "I'm not good at following plans anyway," said Oliver. "What did you wish for?" Archer asked. "A bon voyage," said Adelaide. "Thanks for that," said Oliver. "Thanks for this," said Adelaide, taking another bite. And there's the cake that they made. Cute, right? Looks yummy. Oh, and that's the end. We'll be on chapter 13 tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody.